to introduce Manu Bazzano, who's an author, a psychotherapist and supervisor. And Manu is going to present something called Everyone Wants to be a Manager on masculinity, microfascism, and the Manosphere. Please, Manu, if you like.
Thank you, Onel, and thank you for Del for inviting me. One of my favorite poets, Friedrich Hölderlin, we're talking about 1700 Germany, went through a crisis, and 1794 in August, he wrote a letter to his brother, and I read it here. It's through incessant activity that one matures into a man, through striving to act out of duty, even if it brings little joy with it and appears a petty duty. One matures into a man by denying one's desires, renouncing and overcoming the selfish part of our nature. This was wholly incongruent, inappropriate to who Hölderlin was. Hölderlin is the poet who can see God in nature, who can see the divine in human passions. And to adopt such a legalistic Kantian stance is an interesting move. And it's an interesting move because it also clarifies for me and encompasses the trajectory of what is known as men's work. So I've been involved in men's work as a participant, then as a facilitator. From the beginning of the 90s, some of us might remember Robert Blythe and Iron John. Some people might remember the work of James Hillman, Robert Blythe, Michael Mead, the wonderful anthology called The Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. And how did we get from that particular emphasis, from what it was called, was a mythopoetic movement, gatherings of men, often in retreats where there would poetry being shared, there would be personal stories, there would be an element of ritual, and by all means, not a perfect set of ideas, but one that began to create a good discussion. How do we get from that, from Robert Blythe to Jordan Peterson, a counseling psychologist, Canadian, reactionary? I want to emphasize that word, and I want to qualify what reactionary means. How did we get to that point? That means to men's movement in the present, which are animated by a defensive stance, an attempt to redefine ourselves, men, as a kind of a misunderstood minority. Well, legalism is one of the words. Indeed, as Robert, in his beautiful presentation said, how did he put it? You cannot legislate your dreams. Well, it seems that we are doing pretty well in our effort to legislate society, generally as a profession. This is exactly what psychotherapy enterprise has become. And the men's movement, from the mythopoetic work to the half-baked, third-rate Jungianism of Jordan Peterson, does exactly that. By emphasizing duty, by emphasizing mistaken notions of sacrifice, filtered through various badly digested reading of Nietzsche, Jung, Christianity, you name it. This is a very interesting thing because also it reflects a general socio-political change which has gone from the counterculture attempt to open up psychical and political space to exactly, or more or less exactly, an attempt to police and legislate what is impossible to legislate, the psyche. Let's go into more details. At the heart of the mythopoetic movement of the 1990s was the notion of catabasis. A catabasis means a descent. It's present in many mythologies, from Egyptian to Mesopotamia, Greek, Roman, and so forth. It usually meant the descent into the underworld. Catabasis also means many other things. Socrates used to say, so it literally means kata, down, baino, go, to go down. Socrates would say, I'll go down to the sea from Athens, I'll go down to the local port of a town that I now can't remember. Catabasis will also mean the wind, coming down. It would also mean many, many things. It would also mean a refreshing lowering of tone from highfalutin rhetoric to an intimate, straightforward way of speaking. Essentially, it meant a descent into the underworld. For modern psychology, whatever that is, it means an ability to go down, to be with depression and sadness and the limitation of the self, to face up, face rather than face down one's demons, which is an important distinction, and a necessary movement towards depth that hopefully will result in some sort of inside understanding. But most of all, the important thing is that the mythopoetic movement of the 1990s, for all its flaws, because still there was too much of Jung for my taste in there, this notion of the journey of the hero, it had a lot of weaknesses, but there was something really fundamental being said in those days that really spoke to those of us who had been weakened by believing that women are superior beings. Clearly, women have something wonderful to offer and to teach men, but they're not a superior being, because obviously that would be disastrous in relationship to elevate women. So to many of us who were perhaps had taken too many psychotropic substances, weakened by this idealized notion of anima and animus, and it was really important to have this mythopoetic movement where you could be in the company of men and talk openly and be vulnerable and being open to the wound and to the inner wound that all of us carry, and without which there would be no communication. Because if we were one solid block, we wouldn't want to be really communicated, because we would have everything already in our own little autonomous psyche. But this descent, it was not trauma in the way the current trauma industry, very flowering, very incredibly blooming trauma industry with its own gurus and the reductive discourses has it. It was not a resilience. It was not this profoundly reactionary notion of resilience, which we have inherited and completely swallowed whole from that really dubious brand of psychology that goes under the name of positive psychology. It is importantly, it is also not it goes counter the descent that I'm talking about. It goes counter this false security which comes about with the positivist ideology, or what has been called by some researcher dataism. Dataism, the notion that if we have access to information, the decontextualized information defined on platforms such as Google, the notion that this decontextualized information will give us the ways and means to understand experience, understand the psyche. It is nothing to do with that. And we moved from Bly to Peterson. What characterizes Peterson and so many young men and YouTubers are fond of Jordan Peterson's half-baked form of psychology. What is really interesting about, fascinating in a sort of a creepy way, is the way in which this illusion of control is being sold by these current narratives. So men's group nowadays, they're all about the hero journey, the warrior. And there is this palpable fear of being attacked by a new wave of feminism, by the Me Too movement. And my contention is that the way the current discourses on men and men's work are developing are defensive, and they are reactionary. What does it mean, reactionary? Let me qualify this word. Reactionary means completely taken over and jeopardized by a reactive natural force. What is a very reactive natural force? In the life of a person, an individual, a reactive force is any natural emotion, instinct, a feeling that turns against itself, that cannot accept itself, whether it is anger or desire or sadness. It cannot accept itself, and it turns against itself. And in the social political sphere, a reactive force manifests, particularly, let's leave aside for a moment the men's movement, the men's work, in what is called the Manosphere, the world of the net, where the alt-right and explicit misogyny and explicit transphobia and homophobia is given free rein. Now, normally what people tend to say is that these are isolated cases which do not have anything to do with the mainstream. And my contention is that Google and the whole industry of Silicon Valley and the mainstream, which thrives on dataism, on this decontextualized information, is that there is a continuity between the mainstream industries of information and the wider culture, I would say, and this so-called aberrations. They completely fit together. One example was, you might remember a few years back, the case of James Damore, who was fired, who was a Google engineer, was fired by Google because he published a memo where he said that women are biologically, I quote, less suited to high stress, high status, technical employment than men. And what was interesting about James Damore's point is that his of course, all of his research and information, I mean, this is a typical smart young man in the sort of, the techie smart young man. All his information was, of course, harvested through Google search. And don't we all do that? I certainly do. I'm half ashamed to say, do that, find a lot of material through Google. But his theoretical backdrop was evolutionary psychology. And these two, I almost said these two evils. Okay, it sounds a little too medieval a term, but these two insidious forces of evolutionary psychology and dataism are wreaking havoc in psychotherapy, in the psychological work, and in particular in the psyche of man. So then the whole thing happened. Google sacked him.
Sorry, you've got just about 4 minutes. So.
Thank you. The whole thing, it became an unwitting hero of the alt-right. So that's something to consider. And the contention that I am presenting is a continuity between neoliberalism as it manifests through dataism and the Silicon Valley industry, and this so-called aberration of the alt-right and online misogyny. The other thing that I want to very, very briefly highlight is that, and some of the speakers have mentioned before, there is a reason why some of us men are in this defensive position. It's because the way some of these discourses have been presented, particularly in the Me Too movement, have been exaggerated. There is, and I quote Joanne Wipijewski, an investigative journalist and writer in the States. She mentions the palpable enthusiasm for punishment, the glee with which at the moment the figure of the predator, the male predator, has been demonized. And she also mentions the poison, what she calls the poison solidarities, which is a communal feeling forged from the negative energies of fear, suspicion, and vigilance, deploying, I quote, shunning a punishment as empowering, unifying goals. The anticipating a retribution, she says, enlivens people regardless of ideology, and is accelerated into ordinary, terrible fun. So the thing that I'm saying here is that, of course, there is a defensive position in terms of how men respond to the current situation, the current zeitgeist. And there are more fine points to be discussed. But all of this is, and I conclude, part and parcel of an ideology that is sister or very closely related to neoliberalism and Silicon Valley, woke capitalism. There is the famous example, and I conclude with this example. After the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement, you might know about this famous Pepsi ad, where in the Pepsi advert, a fake demonstration is depicted in which a crowd of young, attractive people is shown hugging and exchanging high fives while holding placards with a political message says, join the conversation. And then the model Kendall Jenner hands a can of Pepsi to the police officer, and everybody cheers and applauds. Woke capitalism in the way it manifests itself has been incredibly clever in co-opting and selling back to us what used to be subversive, innovative, and transformative discourses and practices.
Great. Thank you very much, Manu. Thank you. So many things, especially where you finished up, sort of, really very important things. I mean, the dataism, woke capitalism. I'm of course interested in ordinary. What did you say? Ordinary terrible fun. Anyway, there's so much that's in here, and I'm going to shut up and do what I don't do as a therapist. I mean, I'm going to not talk so much and let you all speak. So please, have you got questions, comments, etc.? Please don't tempt me because I'll start talking again.
Ben's raised his hand, so now.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi.
Come on,
yeah.
Please, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for that, man. I thought it was really, really interesting. I just wanted to, it's more of a comment, really. But I think mentioning Jordan Peterson and the online space and how people get their information is really, really important. And it reminded me of what Chris was saying earlier about the bear pit or the bear trap. He mentioned that you go away from conversations like this. And I think that's where a lot of men are trying to get their information and make sense of the world. And I think Jordan Peterson offers a very rational appearing proposal for people to grab onto. And he himself is a very kind of powerful orator and person, and he kind of models himself in a way that I think a lot of men want to emulate as well. So I think that's something I've been thinking a lot recently in terms of masculinity. So thank you.
Thanks.
He certainly does, but also look at his pet hates, Marxism and postmodernism, and and all the fight about the gender and the pronouns. Yes, surely. I think we should be careful of some type of charisma people are articulated, and Marxism and postmodernism. Marxism essentially deconstructing the iniquity of society. And postmodernism, okay, it's a difficult one, I'll stop there. But it's interesting to notice what he's attacking. The very possibility of psychical transformation. And in the name of essentialism, of, I am a man because I have a penis. Well, to be discussed.
Are there some more questions, comments?
Yep, Paul Salvage.
I don't see why I can't seem to see people.
Yeah, thanks. I think Lisha was first, but just a quick comment really about the sort of myth-operating men's movement. Thank you for that sort of reminder. I used to be quite involved in it, and I don't think I felt fully placed it really. I sort of was a bit embarrassed about it after training as a psychotherapist. So yeah, just thank you for that reminder of the sort of good stuff that was in there really. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Lisa, apologies for keeping you waiting. I'm sure your hand must have been up before. Please, you got something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say about woke capitalism. It's like such a thread at the moment that I'm seeing everywhere. People throwing up quotes from Jung, from Freud, and from lots of really deep kind of embedded theories, and they're just being stolen by this kind of woke capitalistic spiritual notion without really any depth or embodiment, and in that are causing lots of problems in the fields and in the realms of working with people therapeutically, and people using these maybe like lines and quotes and things which are really intrinsically important, but they're not having the academic underpinnings to really hold those spaces and open those discussions in a deeper way.
It's a brilliant point. It reminds me, traveling on the tube, you see, there's this thing that is selling London apartment blocks. And it's all this sort of young, aspiring yuppies. And they're saying, the text says, rebelling never looks so chic. I mean, that's really says it all. How to make fun and make profit out of a movement of so many decades, so many years, you know, from human rights to anti-racism to you name it. It's a slap in the face.
Well, we've only got very little time left. I mean, by the way, I absolutely agree, Manu, with what you've just said. Notice these adverts too. You know, yeah. So please, where we're running out of time, we only got a little more. Del?
Yeah, Manu, I'd like to come back to some of the things you said with regard to legislating against our dreams, but also linked with that, that kind of dialectic that incorporates, you know, you said how good the forces of capitalism, woke capitalism, are able to turn something that might come outside of it back to its own advantage and against those who initiated it in the first place. And so a kind of, I suppose, two related questions really. One is, how do we stay outside? How do we stay outside of the mainstream? Yeah, how do we, I'm so struck, you know, by Robert's client, yeah, who in the UK, yeah, as Nell raised, you know, psychotherapists, counsellors, yeah, whatever, would be encouraged to report that, yeah, as safeguarding. Yeah? The result being the child could well be taken away from your client, yeah, and both have a horrendous life, but the therapist would be okay. It's, you know, just can win, no problem. Just report it. What happens is somebody then comes in who has no therapy at all, yeah, who then deals with the situation with very limited options, yeah. Horrendous violence, but the therapist is okay in a way, yeah. And I suppose that's the first part of my question. The second part is with regard to how, you see, I think that there's, to come back to again Robert's client, there is very little training, either on training programs, but particularly with regard to therapy and supervision, that can, I think, still work with the client that you were working with, Robert was working with, yeah, because we are not encouraged to explore our own sexuality, our own sexual feelings with children, with adolescents, and so on, yeah, and our therapists aren't able necessarily to do it, and our supervisors aren't necessarily able to do it. On my own programs, I first of all enabled anyone to see any therapist of any modality. I changed it so that they would only see people who had training in psychoanalysis, because I hoped that psychoanalysis would be a greater chance of the therapist being able to use Anastasius's words, you know, curious still, and not be caught up with it, and not be caught up with their own safeguarding, as it were. You know, both emotionally because they can't deal with it, and societally because society wants you to just not speak of these things and refer somewhere horrendous. So, and I don't know how much, you know, you're involved in existentialism, Manu. You know, how much, how many existential therapists could actually cope with this? How many humanists? And I wonder now how many psychoanalysts could.
An existentialist does it take to change a light bulb? Would be the question. But okay, I don't want to be out of the mainstream. I want to keep a foot in the mainstream. I don't want to be part of the colorful fringes. I don't want to be out with the, the transpersonal fairies or whatever. 1 foot in. But university has been, I was reading about fungi, the way they overtake, it's a beautiful, they overtake every living thing. The universities have been taken over by dataism. I mean, where I used to work, it used to be Roehampton, people were learning how to measure empathy. I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't tragic. So, and yes, absolutely, psychoanalysis, but I seem to have noticed that psychoanalysis has also been completely hijacked by this sort of compulsion to police. And I mean, yes, there are incredible innovative, subversive strands in psychoanalysis, but you don't hear, where do people teach La Planche? I haven't come across that. Wonderful. Well, here in the UK, I'm afraid we are completely taken over by object relations, by another sort of, shall I say this, normative interpretation of psychoanalysis. So by all means, provided there is also a discussion within psychoanalysis, which psychoanalysis, and so forth. But I think it's a fight worth fighting, and sometimes it brings also joy to be able to discuss with you guys, and also what SAFPAC has created is, it's remarkable. There are pockets. Another one is really keen on is Edinburgh University, the only place where you can say the word post-qualitative. Nobody looks at you like you are nuts.
I'm afraid I have to weigh in and sort of say that we've got a cool time. Thank you very much, Manu, and thank you very much for the comments and questions from the rest of you.